Hey, Steve, what's going on, man?
Hey, buddy.
It's great to see you and catch you before you are about to embark on a new office journey for you coming up.
Yeah, yeah. So my family and I are leaving New York. We've been here for about 15 years. Love the city so much. It has a lot of meaning. It's where I met my wife, where we had our kids, where I came into my own in my career, where I got sober, so many other amazing milestones. But yeah, we've decided to pack up and head to the Catskills/Hudson Valley and build a new life there. So we're ending a chapter and beginning a new one.
One door closes and another one opens, as they
Hmm.
say.
Yeah.
And it's been so fun for us to reconnect because when we met, I mean, we were both in the thick of the startup grind. I think we were both kind of self identified hustlers, out there shaking hands, kissing babies, trying to make shit happen at our startups. And it was, I wouldn't say we lost touch, but we were not in as close of touch as we were previously. And I come back. I pick my head up from the kind of my own startup grind and come back into the online world of Twitter and all that. And I learned that you have very much been on a same directional path of inner transformation and self exploration. And it's just been really really fun and cool to end up here together, man. And so I'm really really excited about us, our relationship, and moving forward and everything.
Yeah. I was thinking back to when we met just last night, and it brought me back to 2010 when we were both getting into New York tech, and boy, were we, I see a lot of similarities in each of us in terms of, a lot of the same attributes, but we've both changed a lot. And obviously, I think for the better. So it's great to be here with you and thrilled to be on the show.
Absolutely. And you're kind of embarking on yet another transformation with the work that you do, which I think
Hmm.
is really exciting and timely. And so, why don't you let everybody know about this kind of new direction that you're taking with your coaching practice?
Yeah. Well, maybe it makes sense for me to back up and just provide a little bit of context. So, I spent the first decade of my career as an operator at a number of large companies and startups. And then I spent almost the second half as a venture capitalist at some of the top early stage firms in New York City. About 5 years ago, I decided to become a coach. And for most of that time, I predominantly have worked with and supported founders, venture capitalists, and there was always this smaller bucket, which I called leaders in transition. And last year, so I guess at the beginning of 2022, I started working with an editor, and we did a bunch of like persona development work around who I was going to write for. And at first, I was like startup founders and investors and operators. And what I found myself writing about was really the journey that I've been on. And the big theme was change and transition and transformation. And I just noticed a lot of the things that I was being called to explore were on those themes. And I went back and I pulled on this long thread about like, why am I coaching founders and investors? And what I ultimately came to the realization of is it was just largely a function of the world that I came from. It was sort of like
Hmm.
the obvious next step. Like, of course, if I'm going to coach, I'm going to coach entrepreneurs and investors. And so I started asking myself this question: well, if I were to start from scratch, who would I want to coach? And uh, I always got so much satisfaction helping people navigate transition. And so, to make a long story short, I recently pivoted my practice. I graduated all my previous clients, some amazing CEOs and investors. And now I'm exclusively working with what I call high performers in transition to ultimately help them navigate that messy middle and ultimately discover what their next calling is. And what's interesting is their next calling doesn't necessarily have to be go build a unicorn. The next calling could be, I want to provide a comfortable life for my family, and that's me going and finding a job at at a company. So anyhow, I'll stop rambling, but that's basically what I'm doing. I'm a professional transition coach, and yeah, I work with some incredible high performers.
Do you notice any commonalities of when someone finds themselves in this type of professional inquiry and transition?
Yeah, I think it happens at different times for different people. Um, I would say that the common theme is that there's something inside that doesn't quite feel right.
Mm,
The
I know
the
what
you
that
know
feels like.
yeah, like the life that they created for themselves a- ultimately isn't the life that they thought they were going to have. And oftentimes this happens in midlife. And I think there's a lot of people that believe that midlife starts like 40s and 50s. And really, that sort of the entrance into the midlife passage starts to happen in the mid 30s, which is exactly when I went through my own change. But I think it's sort of that feeling that something doesn't feel right despite all of the success that I've had. This feeling of going through the motions,
Yeah.
um, losing that energy and that libido to just throw yourself into something. and I think there's another theme, which is just really starting to understand themselves in an entirely new light through consciousness work and other means. But I mean, those are just some. I mean, there's a whole set of indicators that someone is ready to embark in one of these, and sometimes someone might know sort of at the level of their subconscious where it's not fully conscious, but they can like kind of feel it, and it takes a while for them to fully come to the realization that a change needs to take place.
Yeah, I would go as far to say that it can even show up physically. I mean, I remember in my own acknowledgement of being out of alignment with my highest expression and really what I was meant to do, I got sick.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was so used to gritting it out and driving and pushing forward no matter what, that it took that physical reaction for me to stop and recognize, wait a second, something might be off here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think it's the idea that it shows up in the body, or it can show up in the body, I think is a really powerful idea, because oftentimes, especially those in, high performers in tech, specifically in the West, the center of intelligence known as the head tends to be kind of the prevailing form of intelligence. And what I found, at least in my own journey, is the more that I become embodied,
Mm.
it's very, very clear when I'm out of alignment and when I'm fully in alignment. And so I do believe that the body is a signal. I mean, in my own experience, in terms of the passageway, I got sober in 2015. So I guess June 7th of 2015, coming up on 8 years. A year before that, I was in Europe for a wedding. I got served an ad for The Power of Now. I read it in like 4 days, came home and learned to meditate. And that was the first time that I was sitting with myself, watching my thoughts, being in my body. And what I discovered within 9 months is that I had an issue, right? I had an addiction to substances, specifically marijuana and Adderall. I definitely used alcohol more than the average person, but I never identified as an alcoholic. And what's interesting is that it was my body that was telling me. It was
Mm,
the tightness in my chest, like
yeah.
feeling like I was going to have a heart attack. It was the constant sinus infections. It was the clenching my teeth when I slept. And so those ultimately became the waypoint into, okay, yeah, I think it's time to make a change.
And it's so interesting, these different ways that it can manifest. And I think what I experience, what I think a lot of people has experienced is, even when there is that recognition that something's off, it seems as though there's still so much resistance to exploring that. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on why that is.
Well, I can speak from my experience and I can speak from the experience of those that I've supported, but starting with my own experience, I'm an Enneagram type 7. So I'm a head type. And part of my strategy is to feel good, right? Like I don't want to feel pain. I don't want to have to deal with sadness. And so as a 7, I'm pretty skilled at sort of deflecting, rationalizing and pushing away any emotion that's difficult to be with. Now I've changed that over time, but I think it's a lot easier to get in the head, push it away,
Mm-hmm.
compartmentalize, than actually have to sit with those difficult feelings, whether it's sadness, shame, anger, whatever it is, and whatever we were conditioned to, in terms of what emotions were acceptable or not. And so it's a lot easier just to suppress it. But the irony of this is that, emotions are waves and they tend to come through us over, call it 180 to 360 seconds. So within a few minutes, if you're able to really be with your emotions and let them move through your body, they tend to dissipate. And I guess it's my way of just saying that the body actually has a tremendous amount of intelligence. And what we realize is that when we can be with our emotions, we're able to learn a lot more about, our triggers and how we react to them. And this is all critical work as it relates to navigating change and transition, because these are very uncomfortable situations for a lot of people, because it gets to the heart of identity and status and many other, realms that are valued in the West.
Oh yeah. I mean, I I know many people, including myself, that kind of early on in their 20s had a glimpse of what actually made them feel alive. Like what the professional activity was that they were really well suited for, that was in their kind of zone of genius. I
Mm-hmm.
was talking
Mm-hmm.
to, do you know Andrew Horn?
I don't know.
He's a great guy. He's a founder of a company called Tribute. It's like, just, it's a cool application. And we were talking yesterday, and he's like, "Yeah, in my mid 20s, a coach told me that, you know what? I know you're trying to do this whole CEO thing, but you're meant to be a coach."
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind of like, "Yeah, okay, that could be cool, but like I want to make my startup successful." Like, and he spent 7-8 years working on the startup, and only now is he finally comfortable with being a coach. And that's now what he's doing. And,
Mm-hmm.
you might have even experienced the same thing as someone that's now a coach. Why do you think, this kind of friction and resistance to that inner knowing of that thing that we might be really good at, is that something that you feel like you encounter with lots of these people that are making these change? Like they know they do this thing and they really like it, except for there's some type of story as to why they shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the messages that we've been handed down. in our socialization. Often that process starts when we're very young. And, certainly as we, move from being children to teenagers to college to, young adults, is what, James Hollis would call like the first adulthood. We're really living the lives of other people, right?
Mm.
And expectations and things of that nature. And so what happens is we in our minds start to think that a certain path is the right path for us because it's what it becomes the default path, or what we get rewarded for, or it fills a need, whether it's call it like a deep longing for security because we didn't grow up with a lot of money, and we think that if we go and start a hedge fund and make lots of money, then it's going to make us feel safe and secure. So the point that I'm ultimately getting at is that the expectations and norms that are handed down to us end up having a really big impact, and it's not until we're able to actually live life and move through it and hopefully get conscious in that process when we can really begin to wake up with, okay, like, when I was doing this, it kind of drained me. What's going on there? Or when I had this interaction with my co-founder, every time I have this conversation, I get triggered. What's going on? And through that process of waking up, we can really begin to understand who we are. And with that, like your friend Andrew, now he's probably entering his second adulthood, as Hollis would say, where he's now waking up to, oh, actually, it feels this path forward is very resonant to me because I know myself better. And so anyhow, it's a long way of saying, I think that's what Andrew and so many other people experience, is that they wake up to who they really are at their core.
Yeah. And they realize that what they've been doing is a story that they didn't choose.
Yeah,
and that they had to, myself
completely.
included.
Like I did, I on my podcast, Where the Road Bends, I had Jerry Colonna on, and we talked about this exercise that I did around my birthday, where I was reading last summer. I was reading "Let Your Life Speak" by Parker Palmer for probably the fifth time, and in it, he talks about how we go and we find our birthright gifts. There's such an eloquent passage, and what he says is, we're basically disabused of our birthright gifts as we go through that process, by our parents, by coaches, by society, by teachers. And the way to go find it is to go back and look for clues from your childhood as to like the things you were interested in and what lit you up. Anyhow, in October, I decided to do this whole look back that said, how did I end up here? I often encourage all my clients to do the same thing. And what I did is I was like, well, how did I decide to go into business school undergrad? Oh, well, my older brother was driving a BMW and that seemed cool. How did I get into software? Oh, well, I was into video games, but my academic advisor encouraged me to apply to a job at Microsoft, and that was the best job to get coming out of Northeastern. So I got an internship there. And so what happened was I pulled this thread, and what I realized is the vast majority of decisions that I made in my life, in my career, were largely just, mimicking either mimicking other people or following what other people told me I should do because it was their ideal, not mine.
Yeah. Yeah. You realize like all your preferences were conditioned preferences,
Yeah, exactly.
which is just such a fucking crazy revelation, but also so freeing.
It was crazy in that, like, my big aha, and I've written about this in my newsletter, Where the Road Bends, is that I was like, wow, I had so little control. Like, I thought I was driving the car, and I
Yeah.
was like, whoa, like this whole free will debate, I had far less control than I thought I did.
My spiritual teacher likens it to being a robot, which I don't know is I don't know is the most uh, elegant thing, but I feel you where I thought that all the things I was doing and and thinking and everything was because I thought them. And what I really was just an expression of all of the imprints that life had thrust upon me.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I even think about, I had this really powerful moment with one of my closest friends, Zach. This was probably 3 months after I got sober. He and I were walking through Washington Square Park. We used to get stoned together all the time. And I told him I got sober and he was stunned. And I said, I was done being a robot. And I share that story because that moment for Zach was like one of the defining moments in his life. He ended up getting sober the next day and has been sober since. But that idea that we're floating through life unconscious, thinking that we're conscious, is such a scary idea for so many people.
It is. It is because you have so much vest in this identity that you've built. And this is where I think a lot of people in startups and venture capital really struggle because there's this idea, and I've experienced this directly. It's like, well, if you're not a founder and your company's not successful, then you're a failure. And so a lot of startup people, and we just like exited our startup. I'm at Salesforce. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. Like there's this narrative that needs to be acknowledged that like that is your old narrative. That is an old narrative, and it doesn't have to be your future narrative.
That is absolutely right. And those that I work with, in addition to that, what I often see is that when you also talk with a lot of founders, what happens is they don't there's less multidimensionality to their lives because they throw themselves into the company. And so what happens is the company is effectively a reflection of themselves. And so when the company goes away, whether through exit or not, whether it's right, whether it's successful or not, like they're not going to have that company. That's the stability, the routine, like all the things that in some ways like felt like it was stable. I'm putting it in quotes. And now they have to grapple with the fact that, hey, like there's no stability. I'm kind of floating through the air now. And what does this mean about who I am and what my value in the world is?
How do you work with people to kind of untangle this mess and help people figure out what it is that is a great transition for them, even if it's a thesis?
Yeah, it's a process. And if you look at all the great what I think are the great books on transition, the messy middle is very messy for a lot of people. And a common tendency that I see among leaders is that they want to fast forward into what's next as quickly as possible. And sometimes there's good reason, mid 40s, mortgage, multiple kids. Or they rewind and they go back to something that's safe and secure and familiar, as opposed to sitting in the middle and getting very, very still and inquiring about who am I? What energizes me? What do I value? What kind of life do I want to have? How do I want to spend my days? Where's my curiosity go? What are the things that just absolutely depleted me? What are the things that feel effortless and flowing? And so the work that I do, there's a process, and there's now, I have a library of over, 2+ dozen exercises, depending on where they are in that process, to help them, begin to like understand who it is that they are. And oftentimes what happens is I get people come to me and they're like, I'm ready to figure out what's next. And I'm like, wait a minute. Some people, by the way, are like, I'm still in my role. And what I'll say is like, let's slow down. And before you can move forward, we have to say goodbye. And so I often even recommend, I think we need to do a retrospective. Let's go back and look at what's happened the last 5-10 years of your life as you were running this company or in this important role. And there's another exercise that I love, which is called the journey inventory, which is like you're going on a journey. You've been on a journey. It's this never-ending journey, right? It's the never-ending story. But you have a rucksack on, and you've reached a pass, and you get to take a breather because you're going to go try to climb a new hill, and you have to take some things out of your pack. You can keep some things, or you need to acquire some new things for the next leg of the journey. So before we even start to run and sprint to think about like what's next, it's like, let's look back and like, let's grieve whatever experience that is. Like I've worked with executives who have a tremendous amount of resentment, either towards founders or decisions that they made that they regret, not selling enough secondary and leaving lots of money on the table and not walking away with nearly as much money as they thought they were going to have. And so what I often say is we need to deal with that first before we need to be able to make space for what's next. And the way we do that is by grieving and honoring and saying goodbye to this last chapter. And so, then that brings us into, the cocoon or the middle phase, which is just, it's just constant inquiry, peeling back the onion. My spiritual teacher, I use the metaphor of peeling back the onion, and he's like, that's a good metaphor. Like you need to do that. And it's also adding to the whole.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's a long way of saying there's so many different exercises, and it's about understanding where they are in their transition journey and how willing they are to be uncomfortable with those things that are going to be matters of identity and value. And because at the end of the day, what you'll see on the other side, and if you go through journeys like you and I have, where identities are malleable, they're just they're constructs in our head. That doesn't mean that there's not value and importance to them, but like the investor Steve no longer exists, right? And I love that part of me. And now I have a whole new, like a whole series of other identities, and those are going to eventually go away too. And that, it's this constant unfolding of who we are. And the more that we can detach from those identities, the more easily we can sort of move through life and appreciate how it's going to unfold based on where we are in our, like where our energy is leading us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I could see how, and if you don't do the bidding farewell to the old part, how much risk there might be that your future decision is just a reaction to that experience instead of what truly energizes you and represents your highest expression in this moment.
Yeah, exactly. Like I feel so lucky that I get to do this work, because like what is one thing that everybody shares? Transition, right? Everybody goes through change, right? And some transitions are voluntary, right? Like YOLO, I'm going to quit my job and, go on sabbatical and live out of a van and be a nomad and work, maybe consult and coach. That's one way. Another is your fund isn't performing. I'm sorry, but we're pulling our capital and you have to shut down.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, you ran out of capital and we can't find any investors to fund us. Or, you know what? Our tech giant is laying off 20,000 jobs and we're sorry. So the point that I'm getting at is some of these are going to be voluntary and some are going to be involuntary. And, we all go through these transitions. Like it's part of life, and I'm just giving examples of like in the career realm.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of peace in the acknowledgement of continuous reinvention, and like understanding that it's normal and it's part of the process and it's not something to be afraid of.
Yeah. And for many, like change is frightening, right? Because it ties into a lot of the things that we've already talked about. And change and transition, especially, if you're going through like an existential crisis of sorts, it really like triggers defense mechanisms
Mm.
and a lot of other inner strategies. And so what happens is it can be a very uncomfortable time, very uncomfortable time. And it's a big reason why I've decided to do this work is because, if you look at, sort of the way the world is structured, who do you go to when you're navigating these? I mean, I guess you could go to a career coach, but, I personally don't think that that's really the right kind of approach, because the people that, we both know is like, they're not filling out resumes. They're not applying to jobs. Executive coaches tend to deal in the realm of leadership, and life coaches, I think, are perceived as kind of woo woo and not equipped to do. But to me, this work is kind of an infusion of all three to help people navigate this process.
Yeah. And it seems like, and maybe this is just because I'm in my mid 30s, I'm having, many people in my demographic are kind of in this period of transition, whether that's starting a family or they've been doing the same thing for 5 or 10 years. But it seems like this is becoming more of a thing. It seems like more people are going through this. And I would just be interested to get your perspective on why you think that is.
I think there's a few reasons, more than a few reasons. I would say first is how old are you, Scott?
I'm 35.
35. So you're knocking on the door of the midlife passage. You're going to have a child in less than a month. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
This is when, you've had like those, especially those in tech, have tasted enough success, have lived enough in a career to know, like, what do I like? What don't I like? What am I good at? What am I not good at? Where have I failed? Where have my expectations been met? Where have they not been met? And through a lot of this data, they start to say, where like
Yeah.
it is a very
You tried the shoe on. You know what it feels like.
exactly. And for those that have tasted some semblance of success, and I would put both of us in that category, you start asking, like, you know what? I'm more successful than I ever thought I was going to be, and I don't feel any different.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I have some sort of feeling that this isn't it. And I've been told a story that if I start a startup and I sell it, or I go and be a VC for a decade, and what I think people start to realize is like, I sort of did everything that I was told to do, and I don't feel like I'm myself.
Yeah.
So
It's,
so I think that's a big reason.
I got it. Yeah, I 100% agree. And, it's funny. I was doing some writing the other day about like what selling a startup actually is like.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is that the day you sell your startup, it's awesome. You get to celebrate with your teammates. You feel a sense of accomplishment. You share the Techcrunch article, all that kind of stuff. And after that day, you occasionally and with increasing less frequency get to experience these little ego hits of recognition. But 99% of the rest of the time, you're stuck with being how you feels.
Yeah.
And like that's the truth of it. And it's like, that's why I'm so passionate about the inner work, because it's like the only way that I have found to go to the core of how to feel how I want to feel on an increasing, frequency and duration versus this kind of outside strategy, which is also still important. But it just, I had the exact experience you're talking about. We're like, okay, so this is what this feels like. It's really not all that different.
Yeah, yeah, and here's the kicker, Scott, is that 70 million millennials, largest generation in American history, is hitting midlife right now. So I think that's a big reason why you and I are seeing this and hearing it and feeling it, is because the people we're surrounded with are experiencing it. So I think that's a really important reason. I think there's two other reasons that I think we also, with COVID, obviously with the great resignation, whatever you want to call it, quiet quitting, like you're seeing all of these trends where people are rethinking work, and there's more flexibility than ever before, and there's more people exploring consciousness. And
That's
so
right.
I think those are other factors. And then the final one that I think is on the cusp, that, I plan to write about this within the next month, but I think that AI is going to really dramatically change the world very quickly, faster than people think. Within the next 5 to 10 years, the world is going to look very different in a lot of respects, specifically around work and labor. And I think a lot of people, especially millennials, that have spent, whether it's a decade, 10, 15, 20 years, like cultivating a craft, only to see a computer do it, literally at lightning speed, and arguably, maybe not as good, but pretty close to as good. And that's going to bring up a lot for people, because it's going to get to the very value of who they thought they were, right? And like a lot of people in Silicon Valley see themselves as workers, strivers. But what happens when the computers can do your job much better? It starts to open up a whole lot of questions about, how do I want to spend my time? Does it even make sense for, like, where do I even spend my time? Like, what's even going to be relevant? And so
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot coming down the pike that's going to make this, I'm sort of thinking about AI as it relates to workers as the great transition. Like it, and this is going to be the aim of the piece. But I think what we're seeing instinctively coming off the heels of COVID, we're gonna feel it even more in the next decade.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was listening to an episode of All In, and they were talking about a a 3D graphics designer whose job went from creating these beautiful graphics that would emanate from their consciousness to writing mid-journey prompts because of the speed at which they could complete the work. And I have to imagine, what I do hasn't been completely automated, but I have to imagine when that happens, it's kind of like immensely painful, because you feel like you invested so much of your time in this thing that you can't derive value from. But then also scary, because you're like, well, how am I going to make money? And do
Yeah.
I got to start at square one again? And what square am I starting at is safe, because how do I know the same thing isn't going to happen again?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's a topic that I think is going to become more and more front and center in the next decade.
I agree. I agree. And I definitely agree on the consciousness thing, because, with everything that's happening, I feel like consciousness and conscious leadership is like everywhere I turn, which is awesome. Um, but it also is helping people wake up to the reality that their entire experience has been one that they didn't choose.
Yes. And what we're going to see is that as technology continues to accelerate, that there becomes a longing to go back to the world that felt stable.
Yes.
Because with acceleration, the world's going to feel a lot less unstable. And
Yeah.
so in that environment, right, in that dynamic, what do you have? You have your consciousness and your ability to do the work, right, and to be with your experience and the fear. Like right now, I'm doing a lot of work around the fear of like being replaced by AI, and the fear of feeling like the world is going to be far less stable than it is even now. And like, I'm glad that I've done the work so that I can be with my full experience of like, fuck, I'm scared. Like, I'm willing to
Yeah.
admit that I'm scared, and I'm willing to feel my fear. So I think these practices are become more and more important.
It's the only way that I see someone being able to stabilize things and go through them peacefully, and with just the increased volatility.
Mm-hmm.
I think the investment in the uh, the investment in, I guess I would call it, equanimity, is probably the best, safest investment you'll ever make.
Yeah, I recently had a coaching experience. I completed a program with Alethea, Steve March, and his crew.
It keeps coming up.
I'm such a big fan of Steve. I actually have the distinct pleasure. He's going to start coaching me in May, which I'm really thrilled to work with Steve, because he's a master. He's brilliant. And he was coaching me. And I remember it was around the time I was trying to come up with the name for my newsletter and podcast. And I had been like whiteboarding and sessions and asking, everyone, including my mother. And, I remember I did this session with Steve where we ended up like going into my body.
Mm.
Like, it wasn't like, how do I find the perfect name? But it was like, go into your body. And I was like, literally behind me, I was laying on this mat. And within 30 minutes, he's like, what's the problem? I'm like, what problem? There's no problem. And sure enough, like a week later, I discovered the name. But the reason why I share that is like, when we're able to get really present and fully go into our experience, like into our bodies, and just track thoughts and sensations, like without any judgment, what we realize is that it's fluid and it moves. And we might have chest pain 1 minute and have the thought that it's like a rubber bands around a ball, to then going to knee pain, and then that melting, and then going into the thought that, oh, I want dinner tonight. And what we realize is that when we're with our full embodied experience, like, we'll come in and out, and it will evolve, and it will adapt, and it will unfold. And oftentimes when we get into that state, we start to see things as not as big of a problem as we once thought.
That's a really cool experience.
And we can realize that we have the inner resources to be able to navigate it. Like, nothing's missing. We already have everything we need to carve a path forward.
It's one of the greatest gifts ever to recognize that all the answers you need are within inside yourself. And it's really just the process of learning how to go and recognize them and get comfortable with trusting them.
Yeah, it's like the coaching question, which this is like a $1 coaching question, but it works every time. Which is, what advice would you give your friend if he or she were in your position?
Wow, yeah, so simple yet so profound. Dude, well, this has been awesome. I love this conversation. I love talking to you. I love all the work that you're putting out there. And I think this is just a super relevant conversation, man, as we kind of enter this new phase. What advice would you have? Like, what resources, if people are trying to navigate a transition, they sense they might need to be making one soon, where would you point people?
Yeah, well, I would say first, selfishly, check out my newsletter on Substack, Where the Road Bends. I will continue to be writing. I publish pretty much every week, and I talk a lot about transition, share a lot of resources. I would also say that there are a lot of books on transition these days. I've read just about everyone, not everyone, but pretty much like 15 to 20 different. Yeah, student of the game. I would say that the book that I appreciate the most is The Adult Years by Frederick Hudson, who created a coaching institute called the Hudson Institute of Coaching. I think that book is excellent, and it's a very different model than kind of the prevailing model. It's more of a cycle, which I appreciate, and it's 4 stages. And I think like that's an excellent book. I do like Life is in the Transitions by Bruce Feller, though I think it's a little less actionable than The Adult Years. And I've been enjoying From Strength to Strength. I read that twice last year by Albert C. Brooks, who's Arthur C. Brooks, who's a professor at HBS. But there's so many great books, and you could always check out the bookshelf on Schlaf.co on my personal website, where I have basically I'm adding new books pretty much every week as I voraciously consume them.
That's awesome. Well, I have to give the +1 or plus 100 to Steve's newsletter and podcast. They're always thought-provoking, insightful, and also enjoyable to read because you tell your stories, and that's where I think we really learn. And so I recommend checking those out.
Yeah, and I would just say for those listening, the number one thing that I have is, just be patient, right? If you're in a role and you're feeling angsty, which I think a lot of people in transition will feel, is be patient, be easy on yourself, and take the long view. As I wrote in one of the last essays that I wrote, that if you're 40 years old, you still have over 50,000 hours of your career left. If you plan to retire at 65, 50,000 hours, you're not even halfway through your career. And so run experiments, but take the long view and be patient, and have fun. Don't forget to view this as an adventure.
Amen. Amen. The journey is the prize.
Yes.
Well, Steve, it's been awesome, man. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who listened. I will be linking Steve's Substack, bookshelf, Twitter, all the things in the show notes. So make sure to check those out. And Steve, just a final big thank you to you, man. We're really grateful for you.
And congratulations to your expanding family. I can't wait to see pictures of the baby.
Thanks, brother. Good luck with the move, man. We'll talk soon.